Welcome to Mitigate This, the podcast where infection prevention meets real-world chaos. I'm your host, Emily Barnard, and each episode we tackle disasters, disruptions, contamination events, and unexpected challenges that test healthcare systems every day. We break down what worked, what failed, and how to respond smarter the next time. Whether you're on the front lines or leading strategy, this is your space to learn, adapt, and mitigate. So let's get to it and mitigate this. Today, we're diving into one of the most crucial and often overlooked areas of patient safety, instructions for use and sterile processing. Because when sterile processing breaks down, infection risks rise quickly. Today's guest, Adam Okada, is here to help us navigate and mitigate the risks associated with complex instructions for use and their gaps. Adam is someone you absolutely want in your sterile processing corner. With nearly 20 years of sterile processing experience, he has worked just about every role imaginable, from building case carts and working as an SPD tech to leading teams in both sterile processing and high-level disinfection. Basically, if there's an instrument problem, Adam's probably seen it. As a clinical education specialist at Healthmark, a Getting company, Adam is passionate about making sterile processing education more practical, engaging, and accessible for sterile processing professionals and infection prevention partners. You've probably seen him leading webinars, speaking at events, and creating interactive educational content, or co-hosting the Ask the Educator podcast with Kevin Anderson. Known for blending technical knowledge with real-world experience and keeping it entertaining along the way, Adam has a way of making even IFUs and reprocessing conversations genuinely fun to talk about. It is my pleasure to welcome Adam Okada. For our listeners who may not live in the world of sterile processing every day, can you break down the concept of instructions for use, or IFUs, and why they matter so much?
I mean, I know a little bit about it. It really goes back to the old days. First of all, thank you for having me. I should have said that beforehand, but thank you for having me on the podcast. It goes back to like the snake oil salesman way back in like the early 1900s, where these guys were going around with all these potions and elixirs and things that they were selling. And of course, they didn't work. They were selling them for lots of money, but they didn't actually do anything. And so the government decided, well, we can't just allow these people to swindle all the customers, and they created the Food and Drug Administration, kind of policing all of these products that were coming on the market. So these snake oil salesmen were no longer allowed to swindle customers.
When I think about the snake oil salesman, I think about the mercury elixirs and the radium and all those fun things that were in there, and how you just kind of bought into it because somebody told you. You just believed somebody. I always found that interesting.
I mean, that's what these guys did, is they just put water or, special whatever in there and made it colored and did all kinds of things with packaging to make it look like it was fancy, but it didn't actually do anything.
So would you be able to talk about FDA and medical devices, particularly the different grades and how they apply to the devices today?
So medical devices actually started, I think, in the 1930s. There was a statute that the FDA got regulation and oversight over medical products. And then the Medical Device Amendment Act was in 1976, where they really created the three-class risk-based classification system for medical devices. And they also have they established regulatory pathways for medical devices. So previously, the manufacturers were just creating solutions for surgeons or whatever it was, but now the government had oversight over the testing of the products. Are these things being tested before they're going to market? What does that testing look like? How do you prove that it's effective and it can be safe for patients? And then in 1990, there was the Safe Medical Device Act, and that included more post-market surveillance of devices. So they required facilities to report adverse events. This is like hospitals, nursing homes, anything where there were medical procedures going on, they were required to now report. Before that, it was just manufacturers. And you can imagine that manufacturers were not always the most honest and upfront about issues with their own devices. So this really kind of created this aura of safety around medical devices, that if it's not working, that's going to get reported, and then they could actually lose their clearance and we'll have to issue a recall. So a lot of these things happened really in the last 50 years or so, where the devices were becoming safer and there was more oversight going on with the testing and surveillance of it.
Adam, while instructions for use and FDA oversight have evolved significantly over time, we still see more gaps in instructions for use that create real world challenges for healthcare teams. From your perspective, how can stronger awareness, collaboration, and organizational accountability help mitigate these gaps? I'm thinking of one example where an FDA approved product had been used exactly as intended, but under certain manufacturing pressures, there was no validated reprocessing instructions available. After some digging, I found an internal memo indicating sterilization was required, yet there had been no compliance testing on how sterilization would impact the device metallurgy. That ultimately led to a product recall and emergency efforts by reference labs to develop safe reprocessing guidance, all while healthcare facilities were left scrambling and patient care capacity was impacted. So, when IFUs are incomplete, unclear, or developed after products are already in use, what risks does that create for sterile processing teams, infection prevention programs, and ultimately patient safety?
It's about this process with medical devices and going through the FDA. And in certain cases, they had a product that was cleared, and then they changed the materials of it and put the same product out with cheaper materials because, of course, they could still make the same amount of money, but materials are cheaper. But it caused a bunch of infections in patients. So those types of things still happen occasionally. The FDA is doing their best to regulate those things, but you got to imagine there's thousands of devices coming through the FDA at all times. So there are still things that slip through. And with the instructions, I mean, the onus is on the manufacturers to say, okay, did you validate that this item can be, for our case in sterile processing, can it be reprocessed safely? Do you have instructions that if somebody is able to follow them, they will have a clean device on the other side? The problem is that that testing is sort of up for interpretation. They put soil or simulated soil on the devices where they think it's going to be soiled, but it's not always the place where it actually is going to be soiled in real use, because of course they can't test it for real use, right? They're not allowed to test it on people. So they get through their FDA validation process. And then when we get in sterile processing, we're finding problems. And especially with complex devices, you think robotics, if you think of arthroscopic shavers, any of flexible scopes, any of those devices that are just very, very complex, you're going to see issues because the usage and what we are seeing in sterile processing may not match what the manufacturers were showing to the FDA.
Adam, we know there's still plenty of products on the market with IFU gaps, some minor, and some can create serious patient safety concerns. Have you encountered situations where IFU gaps were so significant that you or your team had to step in and develop mitigation strategies just to safely continue operations? And when those risks were identified, what escalation pathways or accountability measures do you typically utilize to protect patient safety while still supporting clinical operations?
I mean, I don't run across it very often. There have been cases in my career where I've seen an IFU that was lacking. I've only reported one manufacturer to the FDA in my entire career. So that's 20 years. That's pretty good that only one manufacturer I had to report, but it was a very severely lacking IFU that they had sent. And there was a more complex one that they had sent to the FDA. It just wasn't sent to customers. So those kinds of things do happen, but I would say they're pretty rare. More of what we see is vague IFUs or things that are difficult to quantify. So in sterile processing, we always use the example of copious amounts of water. What amount is copious amount of water? Like, we have no idea what that is, but that's what it'll say: rinse with copious amounts of water. And so those kinds of things are, again, just something that's a frustration. We do our best to follow them. And of course, in sterile processing, we have to follow our IFUs, but it's not always easy and clear.
Let's shift gears a little and talk about device utilization and off label applications. In healthcare, we sometimes see devices outside of their intended use and validated purposes to meet clinical demands or operational pressures. From a sterile processing perspective and patient safety lens, what risks does that create? And where do you think organizations can get into trouble when they're operating outside of the validated space?
Dealing with the class 1 and 2 devices, Class 3, of course, is things like pacemakers, where it's a little more intense, the validation studies, and they have to prove that they were effective and that they work. But I've seen surgeons that will do off-label use all the time. The biggest one, the easiest example I can come up with is bone cutters and pin cutters. Pin cutters are meant to cut pins that are metal, and they're a little bit stronger, and they're usually double action. A bone cutter is meant to cut bone, and it's not, you can't interchange them because it's going to be softer blade or surface on one than the other. When they try to use a bone cutter to cut a pin, it'll just bend the bone cutter blades, and then we have to replace our bone cutters. So that's an easy example, but there are tons of them. There are always off-label uses, unfortunately, which are not in the instructions for use.
I could think of a product recently where just observing some opportunities in sterile processing and looking at different types of brushes or how are you cleaning your instruments, and even just the devices used secondarily to clean these instruments. Well, it could potentially serve a purpose. However, when you start actually getting down to the nitty gritty components, it could be the composition of this product to how it's designed, the integrity of it, and then going to those standards, looking at, as Amy standards. I think in particularly it's ST79. That's one that really speaks about the composition of brushes in particular. And going to the company and saying, is this approved to use in this manner? And actually having the company say, which I find very interesting, that they could say, yes, you can continue to use it. However, it is off label. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the off-label use. So, I mean, I got to be careful because we're, a device distributor, a manufacturer of products. So, you're always supposed to follow the IFU. Whatever the manufacturer puts in that IFU, whether it's a use, whether it's, instructions for use, whatever it is, that's how you're intended to use it. If you don't do that, you open the hospital up or the facility, and even in some cases, you personally, up to legal action. Because if a patient has an adverse event and it's tied back to that device that was used off label, the manufacturer is not going to say, oh, well, we told them they could do that. They're never going to take that responsibility, right? So it's going to be on the hospital to then take that responsibility. So I would always be skeptical if somebody's saying, well, it's not in the instructions for use, but you can still do it that way. And don't take sales reps' word for it either. And we have sales reps that work at HealthMark. I love them to death. So I don't think we would do that at HealthMark for sure. But I have heard reps in the past that will say things like, oh, you just sterilize that just standard cycle 4 minutes, and then I'll go to the IFU and it'll say 5 or it'll say 8. It'll have different in the instructions than what the sales rep is saying. The sales rep is trying to make it as easy as possible for you, not necessarily tell you this is what you need to do. So it's really difficult in IP sterile processing. It's going to be the same thing to get down to what the real answer is. And you can't always just take people's word for it. You really do need to go to what does it say in writing, and then can I follow this at my facility? Because that's another thing. Do we have all the materials? Do we have the right machines? Do we have the right brushes to actually process this thing according to what the IFUs are saying?
Well, this is a perfect segue to really talk about the MOD database. What a great setup, especially as we're going to start talking about how instruments could be customized so that they fit specifically what a surgeon would like, or even what the organization would like to do. So you're not using tape or another way of using instruments in a different way that, again, might be a little bit off label. I find the MOD database very interesting, especially, well, let's just take a moment. Would you be able to explain what the MOD database is?
The MOD database is the FDA database for adverse events involving medical devices. It's publicly searchable. You can Google FDA MOD. It's MAUDE. And you can actually get to that database and look up the adverse events for certain devices. I think a lot of people, because one of the things we do at HealthMark is I will go out and do assessments. I'll go into hospitals and I'll look at their processes, things like that. And customers will always say, well, we've never had surgical site infection. We've never had an adverse event. We've never had a fire in the surgical suites, all of these things. And then you go into the FDA MOD database and you're looking and you see all just thousands and thousands of entries of devices that had issues, and especially complex ones, flexible scopes, arthroscopic shavers. There's so many in there. So it's a very sobering experience the first time that you go in there. So that's what the FDA mod database is. Again, publicly searchable. It's a great resource for people if you're concerned about a device or you want to see, is this device safe if they're going to bring it in? I would recommend learning how to use that system because it is complex. You can't just type in the name of your device and assume that things are going to come up. You actually do need to learn. There's like 7 or 8 different drop-down menus. You got to learn which one your device will be in. Corey Ofsted actually did a really great webinar, which is now on the HSPA webpage, teaching people how to navigate the mod database, because that's a lot of what she did in her research was searching that for those adverse events.
And she did a really great job looking at endoscopes over time, and you could see the prevalence increase of a lot of these different medical device failures or cleaning errors or different opportunities over the course of the life of different scopes. The one thing I would caution our listeners on is really thinking about just because if you're looking over time and you're seeing this upward trend, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is a big problem that hasn't always been there. This is something that maybe we're now starting to enter information into this database. This is a voluntarily disclosed information, and some hospitals may not be in the direction of putting in their information in there just yet. So just be cautious with the data that you're seeing. It's dependent on the end user and how it goes into the system. But I think the mod database is such an important way of really looking at how some of these different devices can also be manipulated, such as you have an instructions for use for a specific instrument, but it doesn't quite meet the physician's needs. Have you ever seen some instruments that may have been melted or um, customized, changing the metallurgy to create the device that they're looking for, not the device that they have?
Yeah, there was a surgeon, and I'm not going to say the hospital because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. There was a surgeon I was a manager at the hospital, and the surgeon was there and had this custom set of instruments that he brought in to the hospital to be used. And I got him in SPD, and I looked at him. I was like, wow, I've never seen instruments that looked like this before. This is kind of crazy. So I was trying to find the names, and so I was emailing the surgeon. Well, what's the name of? I see took a couple pictures. What is this one and this one? I've never seen these before. They don't have manufacturer information on them. They don't have any part numbers. And he's like, oh, well, those are my custom instruments. I actually did those in my garage. So,
That's a good place for
you
it,
know,
right? What could go wrong?
right. Nothing could go wrong, right? So he was customizing instruments in his garage and then brought them into the hospital. And I had to, sort of give him the bad news that, look, if I don't have instructions for use, I can't tell my staff how to process these. And of course, then there's well, at my old facility, this wasn't an issue. And okay, well, you have to follow instructions for use. And if you don't have instructions for these instruments that you've customized, we can't process them. So we had to go to a third party to actually have these legitimately done, get an instruction for use on these customized instruments. By the way, always be careful with those customized instruments. Make sure that there are instructions for them. Because again, if there's not, the hospital, again, is taking all of the liability with the usage of it. So yeah, don't accept instruments made in someone's garage.
Definitely does not sound like a good idea. Definitely when you're including liability and patient harm. What if that piece breaks off? What happens? And what I think about is a lot of people are really overwhelmed by the number of pages in an IFU. It could be this simple device has a 200 plus page instructions for use. So, what point of that is actually a value to sterile processing and really looking at the infection preventionists as well? What I find is that there's different sections that are really important. There's different pieces throughout, and it can read a little bit like stereo instructions. But can you give tips on how to dive into those IFUs in a meaningful way that you can be more informed about these instruments coming into your organization?
I think access is going to be the most important thing. You have to have access to your instructions for use for every device that's coming into the facility. You can't just say, well, this is the way we've always done it. That's not going to work with a surveyor. It should not work with an infection preventionist who's coming through sterile processing to audit. There is a right way to do things, and it's from the instructions for use. Remember, though, that's how the instrument was validated to get through the FDA. So the manufacturers validated that these instructions, if you're following them, will create a clean or produce a clean device after decontamination. Now, if you're not following those IFUs to the letter, then now the facility who is supposed to be verifying that they can do those instructions isn't actually doing what they're supposed to do. So I think a great tip for IPs going into sterile processing is really ask, what are you doing? And then why are you doing it that way? Because the answer should always be that's the way the IFU says. Now, in sterile processing, there are tens of thousands of instruments. There are cleaning instructions and disinfection instructions and brushing instructions and sterilization instructions and all these different parts to the IFUs. And it's, I would say, unless you have an incredible eidetic memory, impossible to remember every IFU for every instrument in your facility. So it's really going to be on the department to have access to those IFUs, and then on the technicians themselves to actually be looking that up and ensure that they're doing the right thing. One example that I give, because I do a talk on instructions for use and following them, is I give the example Olympus scopes and Karl Storz flexible scopes have two different versions of how you either flush or you pull through fluid through the scope to actually start to clean it out or flush it through. And so again, one is flush and one is you're pulling that solution through from the other side. And which one, I don't even remember at this point, which one is which, but they have these two different instructions. But when I see people doing it, they always do it the same way. Every scope is flush, right? They're not pulling that solution through. So that's where you're opening yourself up. Not that there's a massive difference between those two things, but according to the IFU, you're doing one wrong. So I think that's something that is really important for people to remember, is that those instructions are very specific for a reason, and that it's really important that we follow them. Yes, it's difficult. I would say almost impossible to memorize, but you still have to try to do it.
Adam, let's be honest. Every department has that wall absolutely covered in posters, laminated reminders, and color coded charts. Somewhere, there's probably even a coffee stain going back to 2019. So, do instructional posters and visual references help technicians and OR staff in the real world? Or after a while, do they become part of the scenery? And with every manufacturer seeming to have a different IFU, different steps, and sometimes a different opinion on reality altogether, how do you keep staff from getting overwhelmed while still making sure reprocessing stays accurate and compliant?
I mean, I still think it's helpful for specific, very complex devices. Flexible scopes are some of those that really classify as a very complex device. If you look at the reprocessing instructions for a flexible scope, a lot of them are 175, 180, 200 pages long. It's really going to be hard to pull that up and go through the whole thing as you're processing every scope. So that's why they have those wall charts for some of the more complex devices like flexible scopes. I'd also recommend arthroscopic shavers. Robotics are a good one to have on the wall. Your general instruments, you're probably not going to need them, but just know, and this is something that I point out in my IFU talk also, is there's like a manufacturer like Snowden Pencer has a very specific way for rinsing the instruments, whereas another company like CareFusion might have a different way of doing it. And if you've got all these instruments mixed together in a set, you've got to sort of resolve conflicts in the IFU, and that is very troublesome and problematic. Luckily, in I think it's ST91, and then I think it's also in 79. If it's not there, it will be on the next version, where they talk about when those IFUs conflict, how do you handle that in sterile processing? Because that's really important information to have.
Thank you for bringing up AMI guidelines as a way of to help bridge the gap between conflicting IFUs, especially with complex devices like lumen endoscopes or shavers, where the margin of error gets very small very fast. From the infection prevention side, we naturally start thinking in terms of risk assessments and process variability. What happens when one IFU calls for additional flushing or soaking steps? I think about endoscope pretreatment instructions that give a minimum flush time, but then also say to continue flushing and aspirating until clear, because nobody wants an endoscope arriving in SPD with what can only be described as brown mystery sludge sliding out of the distal tip. And this extends beyond just cleaning steps. For example, some tabletop ultrasonic IFUs still call for the foil test, while others, there are more sensitive, validated performance tests available on the market today. So, if there's an opportunity here to standardize towards the higher,
more rigorous practice when it safely covers a broader inventory of devices. Um, does that create new operational or compliance challenges in and of its own?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely good point that you're making right there. And with the cleaning instructions and things like that, I remember that one facility where we had a lot of different kinds of flexible scopes. We actually looked at all of the IFUs. What do all the IFUs say? What is the soaking time? What does the brushing say? What is, and we created a process for kind of our minimum standards so that we were meeting all of the IFUs with one standard work, if you will. So we have done things like that in sterile processing, but it really takes looking at all those instructions, combining them, and then figuring out what is the best thing for your facility. I would also recommend risk assessments. I am a huge proponent of them. I think that that is the best way that you're going to avoid problems later is if you do a risk assessment and you have that documentation and the surveyor comes in and says, well, why are you doing things different than what it says in the IFU? You could go back to that risk assessment and see this facility, this is what we did, we tested this, and here was our results, and this is why it's in our process. So risk assessments are important. I believe that they are a valuable tool in our arsenal. And if you don't have them and you're doing something not by IFU, I guarantee you surveyors are going to take issue with it.
When we look at the regulatory hierarchy from the Joint Commission, we know how organizations are expected to follow rules and regulations, conditions of participation, manufacturers' instructions for use, and internal policies and procedures. But then we have standards, national standards and consensus guidelines such as AMI, SGNA, AORN, and other evidence based practice guidelines or research that all try to push the field towards best practice and safer outcomes. The challenge is that sometimes these recommendations, especially within AMI technical information reports, or also known as TIRs, can go beyond, even appear to conflict with the manufacturer's instructions for use. So, how would you navigate that gray space when consensus guidelines are aiming for best practice, but the IFUs don't quite align? How should organizations approach risk assessments, decision making, and accountability without drifting outside compliance boundaries, especially as established by the Joint Commission hierarchical approach?
I think that I would defer to what Joint Commission said. So HealthMark actually did a webinar with the head of the Joint Commission Infection Control Committee. And what she said is that what they look at the Joint Commission is they will look at regulations first, because regulations are laws and things that we have to follow, OSHA, bloodborne pathogens, standard, like things like that. And then they'll look at the instructions for use, the facility policies. All those things are things they look at first. They will not examine best practice standards until it's cited in a policy or procedure at the facility level. So keep in mind those standards, AMI, AST, AORN, APIC, all those standards are consensus best practice standards. They're not something that you're going to be surveyed to unless you're citing that or referencing it in a policy or procedure. And in that case, then the surveyor will go back to that standard and see, actually, are you following that? So what I always tell people with that is, look, this is a best practice standard. It's going to raise the level of your practice. I think that best practice standards are very important for us to be following, but for surveyors, they're not as important as if you're following the IFU. So IFU is paramount, your policies and procedures at the facility level. And again, best practice standards are essentially not followed unless it's cited in policy and procedure.
It really feels like an intersection between infection prevention and sterile processing lives within policies and procedures. We, infection preventionists, we want clear expectations and enough teeth for accountability. But at the same time, healthcare is consistently evolving with inventory changes, updated guidelines, and emerging evidence. Definitely be careful what you write down. This component is essential because once highly specific language or consensus documents get hardwired into policy, organizations can unintentionally pigeonhole themselves operationally. So, from your perspective, Adam, what what's the better balance? Do you favor stricter, highly detailed policies that may take months, even years to revise and approve? Or is there more value in a flexible standard operating procedures such as SOPs that can and adapt more quickly to processes, devices, and best practices as they evolve?
I always tell people for policies to really make them not vague, but not specific. So if you say, when transporting a device, it has to be in this type of a container, and then you don't have that container for a tiny device or something larger, it doesn't fit in that container, whatever it is, now you've opened yourself up because you're not following your own policy. And that's always a big hit with surveyors. They want to see, what is the policy for this? Can I see it? What is the step by step? So I always say, like, you're going to do what your hospital is actually doing for a policy, but just cite the information and make it so that your hospital can follow it easily and speak to it easily. And then for procedures, then that's going to be a little bit different, where you can put step by step of what you're actually doing for the individuals that are actually doing that process. The other thing is make sure that staff can actually speak to those things and review your policies. For goodness sake, every hospital I've been to, there's some policies that just haven't been reviewed in 20 years. They've just been, approved and approved and approved, and nobody's looked at them. And then you go back and look, and it's citing a document from 1997, and that's no longer applicable. So yeah, just review your policies, because that's a really important thing that surveyors are going to look at. And don't put step by step or specific products, or and I've seen hospitals get cited because they had put a specific pre-cleaning treatment in their policy, and they should not have done that, because then they changed over to a new manufacturer and got hit on, you're not following your own policy. So yeah, something you got to review.
And even when you talk about just the products, when you're thinking about um, the enzymatic detergent that you're using for the cleaning process, if you look at some of those, your soak time is different. Do you have to monitor the temperature? What all these different components really come into play? And if you write it into your policy, you basically just backed yourself into a wall. And now getting that changed is a lot more challenging versus changing your SOPs. Um,
Yes, absolutely.
I really want to, this has been a really insightful conversation. I really want to thank you very much. And as we're beginning to wrap this up, I really would like to hear some things that you can offer infection preventionists in the way of people going from novice to experienced. How do we support or how does infection prevention support sterile processing and vice versa? How do you get somebody skilled enough to understand what they're looking at and to identify some of these devices that may have been melted or etched, or some of these other things that might fall out of their IFUs?
I think for sterile processing, individuals or professionals reach out to IP. IP is a valuable resource and can be a huge ally to sterile processing. I've heard multiple stories in the industry of sterile processing can't get borescopes installed in their facility. We should have borescopes on every workstation. If patients knew that we had a device that could look inside lumens, but that we weren't using them because they were quote unquote too expensive to put in a department like sterile processing, they would be furious. But luckily, most patients don't know that sterile processing exists, so nobody's up in arms about it. But we have these devices that should be there. And infection prevention can be a valuable tool to say, hey, look, if you're doing an arthroscopic shaver and the sterile processing staff cannot see inside of it, that's going to be a problem. First of all, it's in some of these IFUs that you're supposed to be looking inside of it. If you don't have a borescope, you can't. But also just the infection risk that you have by not following those instructions and by not having the tools to do the job correctly. So if you're sterile processing, reach out to IPs, connect with them, and use them as a resource. For infection preventionists, I think that the biggest thing to do to start is to go to sterile processing and ask questions. Just say, what are you doing? Why are you doing it that way? All those kinds of things open up a conversation. Don't be judgmental. Don't say you're doing things wrong. Don't go into that stuff yet. Just ask questions and start learning that process, because a lot of times sterile processing likes to explain what we're doing. We never get to talk to anyone about what we do in sterile processing. Nobody asks, nobody cares unless the surveyor shows up. So if IP comes in and starts asking those questions, it's actually a really good thing. And that really starts that dialogue. And of course, I think that once you start having that conversation, you'll start learning a lot more about the process. Why do you do it this way? Oh, it's because it's in the instructions for use. How do you access your IFUs? And then see if they can actually do that. That's an important step, because a lot of hospitals have one source, which is an online database for IFUs. But I've seen a lot of users who are actually don't know how to log into it. They've never been inside their account. And that's a little bit scary because they should be going in there all the time. So those types of questions will open up other questions. And that's how you learn the wonderful and terrifying world of sterile processing.
And I really like how you talked about that the culture of asking questions without having any judgment, because that's one of the biggest things. How are we going to learn in a judgment-free area? That you really need to have that just culture. You need to really be able to develop those relationships so that if something goes wrong, you have the relationship, the rapport to say, we need to drill down. We need to see what's going on without people getting offended or concerned that maybe this might end up being, oh, I could be fired or other administrative punitive downstream effects. And just creating that relationship, I think, is one of the most fun and exciting things because SPD is truly a wealth of knowledge. And I definitely am grateful for all the people that I've worked alongside. So, definitely, if you get the opportunity, go in SPD, ask questions, watch what they're doing. And then if you're bored at night, look up a IFU, start reading it and see what they've been what they've been scanning through. And yeah, so I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on and talking with us a little about instructions for use and how to digest and really look at some of these different components. Are there any key aspects that you would like to highlight, circle back to, or
I will say go to Healthmark Academy. It's academy.hmark.com. There's a lot of great education and resources there for sterile processing and for infection preventionists. You can actually search for specific education that's tailored to infection preventionists there. So yeah, there's a lot of great resources, and shameless plug for my Healthmark Academy.
That's a wrap on episode 2 of Mitigate This, IFUs, Risk, and Reprocessing Dilemmas. A huge thank you to our guest, Adam Okada, for sharing his expertise, real-world experience, and a few hard lessons from the front lines of healthcare. Because infection prevention, sterile processing, and patient safety, the smallest gaps can create the biggest risks. The best mitigation strategies start with collaboration, curiosity, and the willingness to keep learning going. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to follow, share, and join us next time as we continue tackling the disasters, disruptions, and unexpected challenges that test healthcare systems every day. Until next time, stay prepared, adaptable, and always mitigate this.